Riots, which started in Southport, spread to London and Hartlepool after misinformation about the perpetrator of a knife attack which killed 3 little girls spread online. Rioters have been linked to far-right groups like Patriotic Alternative. But it's not the first time that England's seen rioting on its streets. It's not even the first time this summer. These riots all have different trigger points and different people taking action. Still, I want to know, why do English people riot?
Crowd violence is relatively rare. Characteristically, crowds are intergroup affairs. It's not just the crowd, it's the crowd and another group. It's the crowd and the police. It's the crowd and rival supporters. So we've got to look much more at, if you like, the dynamics between groups and the way they produce violence. We tend to enter into those crowds and there is a shift towards the group identity. We start behaving in terms of group norms and group beliefs and group priorities. The success of the group becomes more important than our individual success. And only if we understand that can we begin to understand the patterns of crowd behavior and the dynamics of crowd behavior. Characteristically, in political crowds and political demonstrations, you have multiple groups with multiple intentions. Now, some of those intentions might be unlawful, right? Some people might want to attack a particular target. Not everybody will. Often what you see in large crowds is, and those mixed crowds, is that the police, in seeking to deal with some within the crowd, clamp down on everybody in the crowd and stop them doing things they think they've got a right to do. And that increases antagonism. It increases, if you like, the influence of those more radical elements in the crowd. So we often see those types of events where the interaction between the police and the crowd, in a sense, changes the influence within the crowd and gives more influence to more, if you like, violent elements, more conflictual elements. To be fair, the police have addressed that, and over the last 20 years or so, in part through the work I'm describing, the police have understood those dynamics and attempted to address them by what they call facilitative policing. So rather than starting off by trying to stop things in the crowd, you start with the question of what are the legitimate things that a crowd wants to do and how can we help them? And then the majority of the crowd will side with the police and not with those more violent elements. We know that the far right was involved in the riots. We don't know what proportion were involved. We don't know who else was involved. We don't know exactly what their motives were and what they were doing. So quite frankly, I don't think we are in a position to fully diagnose what happened beyond being able to say there was some element of far right involvement and there was some element of people who weren't part of the far right. I mean, Hope Not Hate have shown that actually most people there were not members of the right, but the right did organize it and the right did provoke it. And sometimes when you have a group whose aims are unlawful to attack a particular target, then you're going to get violence. However much you facilitate, the police cannot facilitate violent attacks on other groups. The point is that not all crowds have, if you like, such negative aims, and if you facilitate them, you win the majority of the crowd onto your side, and you actually engage the crowd itself in self-policing.
The riots that saw shops on streets like this one smashed and London set alight for 5 nights in the summer of 2011 were dismissed at the time as pure criminality.
We will not stop until this mindless violence and thuggery is defeated and law and order is fully restored on all of our streets.
10 years later, we can find a different, more nuanced story to tell, of austerity Britain, of young black men racially profiled by the Met. I want to know more about what we can find in the violence that unfolded in Southport.
This wasn't a genuine outpouring of grief about children that had been murdered in some cases. Some of the footage you see people laughing and joking and dancing. It was an excuse to engage in violence. It was an excuse to act out on their discriminatory and prejudiced views. Social media was fundamental to what happened on Monday night and is also fundamental to the subsequent events that we're seeing last night and the ones that are being planned for the coming days. within a matter of moments of the news breaking of the attack, we started to see misinformation being spread. We started to see new accounts being set up. We started to see groups on various different social media apps being created to organise demonstrations and events. But we also saw major figures like Andrew Tate, the famous misogynistic extremist, putting out really false information, consciously disinformation, misinformation, that was being viewed millions of times. And I think it's really worth noting that a large number of the individuals that were most central to spreading misinformation had previously been deplatformed from Twitter, or X as it's now called, and had been given their platforms back by Elon Musk. So social media plays a fundamental role in the whole way that the far right organises now.
We saw Nigel Farage take to Twitter to ask what he said were fair and legitimate questions about whether the truth was being withheld about these attacks.
Was this guy being monitored by the security services? Some reports say he was, others less sure. The police say it's a non-terror incident, just as they said the stabbing of an Army Lieutenant Colonel in uniform on the streets of Kent the other day was a non-terror incident. I just wonder whether the truth is being withheld from us. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it is a fair and legitimate question.
What do you think the role of Nigel Farage and people like him was in mobilising the people that we saw in Southport?
But it's hard to be shocked by Nigel Farage anymore, in the sense that increasingly, during the recent general election campaign, some of his rhetoric was very, very extreme. It was indistinguishable from anything that Tommy Robinson says. It's why people started calling him like Tommy Robinson in a suit. But I do think the comments he made about the events in Southport in the run-up to the riot that night were really extraordinary. This was a man who now sits in Parliament. This is an individual who called into question the official police's account and also consciously spread misinformation and disinformation that was designed to be a nod and a wink to his supporters on the far right. And he did it in a traditional Nigel Farage way. He didn't come out and say, "I believe this." He couched it as asking questions. But the effect was the same thing. Those people on the far right, those individuals that already believed that this attacker was a Muslim, when they hear Nigel Farage ask the question about whether or not this person is on an MI6 watch list, he's done his job there. He's stoked up the flames and he's also continued to spread that information. If he wanted answers to those questions, he's an MP, he could have got answers to those questions. He could have gone to the House and asked them. But he didn't. He chose to go on social media and amplify and spread misinformation.
What else do we need to do, either legislatively or as a society, as communities, to prevent events like the violence in Southport happening again?
I think what we're seeing, a lot of what we're seeing here, is the result of many, many years of a lack of any sort of serious discussion about cohesion, especially from the government. There hasn't been a conscious cohesion policy now for some years. The last Conservative government for many years seemed uninterested in discussing the notion of cohesion. And multiculturalism is a wonderful thing in many, many ways, but it takes work. This is something that we can't just take for granted. We have to understand how a community is relating to each other. How is it that we can try and build systems that are in place so that when these things emerge, tensions don't spill over into violence and riots and community tensions. This is a big challenge for the new Labour government. This is something we need to see more on the agenda. Currently, we're not seeing much of it. What is the new government's policy to discuss a proper plan for cohesion across the country? And I think that, as well as discussing things like social media, but also as well as saying what do we need to be doing about the far right itself, together it's going to take all of those things to actually try and make sure that next time something awful like happened in Southport happens, we don't see this kind of string of violence that follows it.